And I'll also mute all. And feel free to interrupt with a question or a comment at any point. But it's just easier to be on mute all. And again, I keep on apologizing for the lack of consistency with this class because of whatever's going on Monday nights, whether it's a board meeting or something else. Um, but anyway, there's still plenty of topics to talk about. So what I wanted to share tonight is actually something that I had been keeping um, since January when I saw this article in Times of Israel that did a report on that what the ADL reported about global anti-Semitism, and I wanted to, so I cut and pasted from two sources here. First, this is the article from January 14th from Times of Israel, which we'll go through. And then after the article is also from the U.S. State Department back in July. So I don't, but it was still updated as of the beginning of February. So whoever's updating this for the Office of the U.S. Special Envoy to Monitor and Combat Anti-Semitism, that office must still be there. But we'll be referring to that also. So, like I said, there's plenty to talk about in the news today, which for our purposes is not a good thing. Um, and um, and I've been talking a lot about the impact of policies and directives from the current administration, both executive orders and from the so-called Department of Governmental Efficiency, and the effect that has, the tremendous effect it has had on the United States in general and federal employees specifically, but really on all of us. So there's a lot that we can talk about there, and I've been referring to at Shabbat services, and still we pray for the release of hostages from Gaza, and there are still, we think, 24 of 59 hostages being held that are still alive. We pray for their return and that governments involved, state of Israel and Hamas and other mediating officers try to come up with a plan soon for them. And the civil war that continues in Syria, in which over the weekend 1,000 civilians who are aligned with President Assad's ruling family, the Alawites, were just massacred. People not really talking about that. You can read about it in Times of Israel, but you don't really read about it anyplace else. So those are just a few glaring things that we could talk about. But in the midst of all this over the past few months was this article, which was headlined Global Emergency. Nearly half the world's adults hold anti-Semitic views, ADL survey. The worldwide study finds that 46% of population believes in a number of anti-Jewish tropes. 20% have never heard of the Holocaust. Okay, so that's a terrible headline, but I'd like to read the article and go through it to understand exactly what this is talking about. Nearly half of all adults worldwide, so this, if you put all the statistics together from all the countries, nearly half of all adults worldwide hold significant anti-Semitic views, and younger people are more likely to discriminate against Jews, according to an Anti-Defamation League survey released on Tuesday. The global survey asked 58,000 respondents in 103 countries and territories if they agreed with 11 anti-Semitic tropes, such as the Jews' loyalty is only to Israel and Jews have too much power in the business world. If respondents believed that more than half of the statements were true, they were categorized as having significant anti-Semitic beliefs, ADL Chief Jonathan Greenblatt said in a briefing, calling the findings a global emergency. Why do attitudes matter so much? Because attitudes lead to action. When anti-Semitic views are normalized, when anti-Jewish bigotry takes root, it creates an environment where Jews become more vulnerable, he said, tying the anti-Semitic views to incidents such as the attacks on Israelis in Amsterdam back in November. In total, 46% of adults backed the majority of the anti-Semitic tropes, representing around 2.2 billion people, which is pretty scary to think about that. The level of anti-Semitism varied widely by country and region. The Middle East and North Africa had the highest levels, with around three-quarters of respondents endorsing a majority of the anti-Semitic statements. Anti-Semitism was most prevalent in the West Bank and Gaza at 97%, followed by Kuwait and Bahrain. 59% of the region held a favorable view of the Hamas terror group. Iran was the least anti-Semitic of the 18 countries in the region, with 49% of respondents holding significant anti-Semitic views. So that's interesting. If the West Bank is at 97% of strong anti-Semitic views, that Iran is only 49%, that's just an interesting statistic. It's still high, but it's not as, and you'd think that Khamenei is talking about destroying the Zionist entity. You would think then that he speaks for all of Iran. So Greenblatt ascribed the widespread Jew hatred in the region, that is in the Middle East, to Al Jazeera, calling the news network a non-stop fountain of anti-Semitism. Al Jazeera's Arabic coverage differs significantly from its English language coverage, right? I think on some cable packages, you can get Al Jazeera, and it might seem like a reasonable kind of news outlet, but that's done on purpose in English. But when it's the original Arabic with separate reporting, separate news features, separate news announcers, it's quite different. And Iran is the only country in the region besides Israel that does not mainly speak Arabic, right? They speak Persian. So Al Jazeera might have the Persian language is called Farsi. It might have a Farsi language network, but it's just interesting that clearly Al Jazeera in Arabic is pretty anti-Semitic, and if that's the major news source that people are going to in the Arab world, from Morocco to Afghanistan. Well, no, they don't speak Arabic there. So from Morocco to Iraq and everywhere in between, that's a pretty extensive network of people to be reaching out to and have influence over. Western Europe was the least anti-Semitic region at 17%, which is surprising to me, but at least that's about the strong feelings of anti-Semitism, followed by the Americas at 24%, Oceania 20%, Sub-Saharan Africa at 45%, Eastern Europe 49%, Asia 51%. And you wonder why Asia would have a strong anti-Semitic feeling when there aren't that many Jews actually that live in Asia. I mean, Chabad is everywhere, but it doesn't mean that Jews are actually living there. There are business people, but are there is there like a Jewish community in Cambodia? I don't think so. And Japan has a very small community. China has a very small community. But again, you have the propaganda machine that is China, the information that it gives out to its population um, about Israel and about Jews is interesting. And India actually has a very strong relationship with Israel, at least business relationship. And I don't know if India is included in Asia here with the anti-Semitic figures at 51%, and the Middle East and North Africa at 76%. The least anti-Semitic countries were Sweden, Norway, Canada, and the Netherlands, which is interesting to me too, because Norway happens to be one of the most anti-Israel countries around. That is, countries that vote in significantly and most often vote in favor of Palestinian issues and voting against Israel. Norway is consistent with Ireland, um, uh, right with them, always voting in the United Nations against Israel. So that the fact that it's one of the least anti-Semitic countries is interesting to me because I think that anti-Semitism and anti-Israel usually go hand in hand. That when supporters of BDS, the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement against Israel and in support of Palestinian causes, the BDS movement claims to be anti-Israel and not anti-Semitic. But a lot of a lot of how it presents its information does come across it as anti-Semitic. So, and you have this at Columbia University and other universities across the country as well, that anti-Israel and anti-Semitism usually go hand in hand. So the least anti-Semitic countries were Sweden, Norway, Canada, and the Netherlands. Israel was not surveyed. In the US, 9% of respondents held significant anti-Semitic views. So 9% is pretty low. Significant anti-Semitic views, again, is these statements right here. Jews still talk too much about what happened to them in the Holocaust. Jews don't care what happens to anyone but their own kind. People hate Jews because of the way Jews behave. Jews have too much control over global affairs. Jews think they are better than other people. Jews have a lot of irritating faults. Jews have too much control over the media. Jews are responsible for most of the world's wars. Jews have too much control over the country's government. Okay, so these are anti-Semitic tropes, and so only 9% in America um, agreed with more than half of these statements to make it significant. Okay, so that's not bad, but it's still an increase. Russia was the most anti-Semitic country in Europe at 62%. The global figure represented a 108% increase in significant anti-Semitic views over a similar survey conducted in 2014. So in 10 years, the significant sense of anti-Semitism increased by 108%. I don't have the words to adequately describe how dangerous the spike is, Greenblatt said. Matt Williams, the vice president of the ADL Center on Anti-Semitic Research, said certain views were correlated with anti-Jewish activities on the ground. The belief that Jews were primarily loyal to Israel was tied to Jews being targeted in anti-Israel activities. And the view that Jews are only concerned with their own kind was predictive of hostility towards Jews, he said. Many countries held widespread anti-Semitic views despite lacking any significant local Jewish population, right? So that's why I said, like China, Russia has Jews, but it certainly does not have as many Jews as it had um, before the Iron Curtain came down, right? There were 2 million Russian Jews who at least who left Russia over the course of that time. So like I said, there is a Jewish population in Russia, but it's a shell of what it had been. And Japan, like I said, Japan, China, hardly any Jews in China, and yet country and Arab countries. The Jews, they used to be a significant population in Egypt, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Iran, in Iraq. And then with the establishment of the State of Israel, either Jews were killed or kicked out. So there are Jewish communities left in those countries, but hardly anything. And the fact that there is such rampant anti-Semitism in the Arab world, well, that's all about Israel. Okay? For respondents under the age of 35, half held anti-Semitic views, 13 percentage points higher than among those over the age of 50. So that's a scary thing too. The younger people are more anti-Semitic than older people. The survey also queried respondents on the validity of the Holocaust's historical narrative. Only 39% of adults aged 18 to 34 endorsed the mainstream narrative of the genocide, with the remainder saying the number of deaths was exaggerated, that the Holocaust was a myth, or that they had never heard of it. Can you imagine? So 60% of people around the world either think that the information about the Holocaust is exaggerated or they've never heard of it. That's a frightening thing too. For the general population, 48% endorsed the historical narrative, and 20% said they had not heard about the Holocaust. Marina Rosenberg, ADL Senior Vice President of International Affairs, called the views of young adults a demographic time bomb. Some of the survey's findings were more favorable towards Jews in Israel. 57% of all respondents said that anti-Jewish hatred was a serious problem. A majority, 75%, said their country should welcome Israeli tourists. 71% said their country should have diplomatic ties with Israel. And 25% supported boycotting Israeli businesses, although those questions were not asked in all countries. So it's interesting. 71% still said their country should have diplomatic ties with Israel, even though they hold anti-Semitic views. So it's one thing to have a bad feeling about somebody. It's another thing to accept the money from them and to do business with them. The questions about Israel, them, mean us. The questions about Israel and the Holocaust were not included in the survey's scores on anti-Semitism. Greenblatt attributed the spike in anti-Semitism in the last 10 years to the rise in conspiracies, populism, and polarization, alongside the influence of social media, particularly among the young. The Hamas invasion of Israel on October 7th also served to pour fuel on the fire, he said. The ADL conducted the survey with the researchers conducted 80 languages, 58,000 interviews in 80 languages and dialects, mainly by phone, between late July and early November 2024. That's amazing. So to combat anti-Semitism, the ADL called on governments and organizations to adopt and implement the global guidelines for countering anti-Semitism, a framework launched last July and endorsed by dozens of countries and multilateral organizations. And here is what it is based on the State Department's website. So this is the Global Guidelines for Countering Anti-Semitism, a landmark international framework was initially launched in Buenos Aires in July and endorsed by dozens of countries. And this is what it says. Concerned states, special envoys, national coordinators, and representatives tasked by their governments to counter anti-Semitism, in cooperation with international bodies, offer the following best practices which have proven to be effective guidelines in formulating public policy. These legally non-binding guidelines adopted in Argentina include policies to monitor and combat anti-Semitism that can be implemented and adapted to a wide variety of national, regional, and cultural contexts. So this is what it is. We urge all states and international bodies, as well as civil society, to embrace and use these practices, many of which already form the basis of regional and country-based action plans. These guidelines can be applied everywhere, not only in societies with Jewish communities. Speak out. Governments and political leaders should denounce anti-Semitism swiftly, clearly, and unequivocally whenever and wherever it occurs. This applies to the domestic and international arenas, including regional and international organizations. So this is always an issue about speaking out. There's in Australia recently, over the past couple of months, synagogues in Sydney and Melbourne have been defaced and in one case firebombed. And it's been a question as to whether the mayor of those cities or the governors of those states or the Prime Minister of Australia spoke out quickly enough and forcefully enough against those anti-Semitic attacks. Avoid politicization. Anti-Semitism can appear across the political spectrum and should be rejected without political bias and regardless of its origin. In other words, it's not a Republican or a Democratic issue. It is an issue all by itself. Um, Adopt and implement. Governments and international bodies should adopt and implement strategies and action plans that engage all relevant ministries and public authorities at all levels of governance. This should be done in consultation with Jewish communities, civil society, field researchers, and other relevant stakeholders. Such policies should be assessed periodically and updated as needed. So, the issue with anti-Semitism is the issue with a lot of authoritarian and far-right governments that are becoming more popular around the world. And the more it tends to be that the more far-right governments usually are characterized by being anti some kind of group within their country. Right? You just have like the in our country, the anti-immigrant sentiment that is rampant and deputizing state police officers in the state of Virginia to be ICE officers so that they can do the work of ICE in the state of Virginia, as an example, to find illegal immigrants and round them up and deport them. So it's a fine line between saying we want to make sure that people who are here illegally are taken care of, and then just rounding up people and accusing everyone who doesn't look like a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American to automatically assume that they're an immigrant. So it doesn't take long to go from one step to the next in saying that everybody is related to this one group, and we hate that group, and they bear the ills of our country. So we're very familiar with that, with what Hitler did in the 1930s to lay the groundwork for his final solution for the Jews. So it tends to be far-right governments that are imposing these bigoted, prejudiced, biased statements about segments of their population, and it makes it even that much harder for the ADL to have any influence in those countries. Appoint and empower. Governments and international bodies should consider appointing national coordinators, special envoys, or designated officials. Such officials can proactively address anti-Semitism as a cross-cutting public policy challenge and should be provided with the necessary authority, empowerment, and resources to be effective. So, so President Biden appointed Deborah Lipstadt to be the official anti-Semitism czar for the United States. I am not sure, and I didn't check to see whether President Trump has appointed somebody to take her place. I don't know, but at least the State Department website is still up and running. Understand and define. In order to combat anti-Semitism, governments governments need tools to understand its various manifestations. The legally non-binding International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism is an important internationally recognized instrument used by over 40 UN member states since its adoption in 2016. In addition, hundreds of subnational public authorities, universities, sports bodies, NGOs, and corporations rely on it. So that's another thing about there is a movement afoot to get countries to agree to this working definition of anti-Semitism so that everybody knows what they're talking about when we accuse authorities of being anti-Semitic. Protect. There are few roles more central for governments than the security and welfare of their populations. Jewish communities are targets of physical threats and attacks from both foreign and domestic sources. Governments working together with Jewish communities should provide appropriate protection and security enhancements that safeguard and sustain Jewish communal life. Religious freedom and protection also encompass safeguarding unhindered religious practice. So just look at the book of Esther, which we're going to be reading Thursday night and Friday, right? You have King Ahasuerus willing to pay Haman 10,000 talents of silver to kill all the Jews because Haman accused us of being this people throughout the empire who refused to follow the king's laws and dare to live amongst themselves and practice in their own way. So the book of Esther contains these anti-Semitic tropes, and here you have the king, the foolish king, going along with it. Collect. Policies should be in place to support the uniform collection of data documenting incidents of anti-Semitism, as well as the perceptions of anti-Semitism among Jewish communities and the broader public. Such information, drawn from community-based sources when possible, allows for evidence-based understanding of trends and sources. So the ADL works very closely with the FBI, and we're in a good place in America to at least understand what the data is about anti-Semitism in this country, the different kinds of anti-Semitism, violent acts to bullying and things like that take place in public school and other incidents like that. So the ADL works very closely with the FBI to report those, monitor those, and understand them. And then enforcement of hate crime and anti-discrimination laws is critical and should take place within legal frameworks that protect civil liberties and human rights, such as freedom of expression. Enforcement conveys the broader message that anti-Semitism is unacceptable, has consequences, and cannot be tolerated. Educate. This, I think, is one of the most difficult things to do. Education is vital for identifying and countering anti-Semitism, including Holocaust remembrance and countering Holocaust denial and distortion, and especially pernicious form of anti-Semitism. It is also proven effective in sensitizing law enforcement. Education about Jewish culture and contributions to society demystifies Jews and Judaism. Many countries and intergovernmental organizations have linked their efforts against anti-Semitism to broadening appreciation of Jewish heritage and fostering Jewish life. There isn't enough education happening, but I know one of the members of our congregation, Bill Sumner, volunteers as a docent at the United States Holocaust Museum and often has told me about groups that he leads around, and many of the groups that he has led over the past several years have been groups of police officers from different jurisdictions across the country. So the education is happening, but the education here that would be most effective is if Holocaust education was a regular part of the high school curriculum all across the country. And it's not. It's in certain states, but it's not in all states. And then what about private schools too? Do private schools teach about the Holocaust? So it's one thing to get it into the public school curriculum. It's another to kind of make it into a private school curriculum, especially the archdiocese, the Catholic school curriculum. So I don't know. I remember, before October 7th, I had talked about how the drama teacher at the Good Counsel High School here in Olney had reached out to me because she was going to be working with the drama club to put on the Diary of Anne Frank, and she wanted me to come to kind of talk about anti-Semitism, and especially anti-Semitism at that time of Anne Frank, to the cast. So was that an unusual thing for Good Counsel High School to do that? Because the drama coach just thought that it would be important to do the Diary of Anne Frank, or was it part of the curriculum of Good Counsel, which is a curriculum of the Archdiocese of the United States, to have some kind of Holocaust education? So it's the education is really important, and I think what isn't on here is also making some kind of entree into other religious groups, because anti-Semitic tropes are not just prevalent within secular society, it's especially prevalent in religious society, because there just are. It's in the Christian Bible that Jews killed Jesus. So it's kind of hard to counter that if Christianity doesn't counter it and say we need to understand, we being Christians need to understand that the Bible was speaking at one time 2,000 years ago, and we need to change our approach. So the Catholic Church tried that in the early 60s with the Second Vatican Council, but certain anti-Semitic tropes are still prevalent, and are broadly understood within the Christian community. Islam is the same way, because even though Muhammad had a positive relationship with the Jewish community in Saudi Arabia at the beginning, when the Jews weren't flocking to him, he was naturally upset that they weren't embracing his approach. So there are some anti-Semitic tropes within Islam too, but understand in Jewish history, when Jews have lived in Muslim countries, we have fared far better than when we lived in Christian countries. So there's something about Islamic culture that, even though it claims that Islam is the highest, and that there were laws on the books that other religious institutions, no, let's say it in a positive way, the minaret of the mosque had to be the tallest point in the town. No other religious institution could be any taller than the minaret of the mosque. So, and Jews did have to dress differently at some points within Muslim countries, but Jews were still able to participate in everything in Muslim society. Go to college in Muslim society, in Muslim Spain, before the Christians took over 1,000 years ago. There were universities there, and Jews reached the highest levels in all of Muslim society. So I'm saying it with the education here. What this doesn't reflect is education within religious groups too. Cultivate a whole society commitment. Countering anti-Semitism requires a whole of society commitment that includes the active participation of civil society. Collaboration, bridge building, nurturing trust among faith, civic, and cultural leaders, and fostering mutual understanding are essential, particularly since anti-Semitism is not solely a threat to Jews. It can endanger members of other minority groups, democratic values, and national security and stability. Right? That's something that we that countries tend to forget. And it's happening today. I think that we just have the tendency, okay, I'm not a federal employee. Why should I need to worry about federal employees? I don't know, I'm not a veteran and I don't receive veteran benefits. So why should I worry about cuts to the Department of Veterans Affairs? Climate change isn't affecting me personally, so why should I care about cuts to NOAA or any other environmental protection agency, et cetera, et cetera. It's a common human frailty and weakness that if we're not directly being threatened, then our default position is we don't worry about it. And so this is what the ADL is suggesting here in this global way to combat anti-Semitism is really to go against human instinct and how hard it is. We know how hard it is to overcome human instinct and to be better people and to try to educate people. So it can happen, but it takes a bold leader to adopt this and to say that this is what our country is going to do now. And it's rare that, from a Jewish perspective, that has happened in our 4,000 years of Jewish history. Engage social media. Anti-Semitism, like other forms of group hatred and disinformation, is widespread and mutating online. It has real-world consequences and can lead to radicalization to violence. Stakeholders should oppose anti-Semitism online, stay educated on evolving trends, increase transparency about anti-Semitic content, assess impacts on vulnerable communities, and find solutions within a context of existing legal frameworks. I think this is the hardest thing to do, is how to combat anti-Semitism or any kind of hate on social media. It's almost impossible to do because there is no forum or accepted control over hate speech. It's very limited. It's very limited in what Facebook does, or what Twitter does, or what X does, or Instagram, or anything like that. You can put in some controls as a parent for what your child can see on social media, but the content itself, it's almost random as to what is censored and what isn't censored. So anybody can post almost anything on social media, and this will be the most difficult thing to do. And so it's easy to post. What's hard is to get the people who are posting hateful things to actually see something that the ADL posts, because you can filter who you follow. So why would somebody spewing hatred be a follower of the ADL? So, in other words, the ADL's postings wouldn't appear in the feeds of conspiracy theorists. So that's why it's so difficult to be able to overcome that hurdle in social media. Strengthen international collaboration. Coalition building and international cooperation are paramount to effectively monitor and counter anti-Semitism. In an interconnected world where hate respects no borders, transnational cooperation can identify threats, raise awareness, broaden the use of best practices, and more effectively and proactively coordinate responses. I will say another effective way to combat anti-Semitism is if the countries who are still technically at war with Israel were to declare peace and establish diplomatic relations with Israel. I think that if that were to happen, then the whole framework of those countries and what it allows to be published in the media about Jews would change, because if the Arab country makes peace with Israel, then theoretically they're going to change their attitude about Israel, and maybe that change in attitude can trickle down to what it teaches about Israel, what it portrays about Israel in media and culture and things like that. So I think peace with Israel goes hand in hand with combating anti-Semitism as well. So these are just the countries that have endorsed this, and the United States is, of course, uh, on the list as well. So that's what I wanted to say about this. Any questions or comments about this? Yes, Stacy.
So a couple of things. One, when you were going over the different types of the tropes, the anti-Semitic tropes,
Yeah.
it reminded me of the book that I read late summer, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Jew by Noah Tishby and
Oh.
Emmanuel Ocho.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody needs to read that book
Yeah.
because she lists all of those tropes in there and more. And also going back to the anti-Zionist, she does list that as one of the layers of anti-Semitism.
Right.
So she has the four layers are peoplehood, religion, racial, political, and anti-Israel are the
Right.
four layers of anti-Semitism. So that was the first thing I wanted to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
The second thing, the education. Oh my gosh. So I try to educate the people that I'm friends with on Facebook because I have a fair few friends and my in-laws who are not Jewish. So I try to share information when I can to help them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I work with people
Mm-hmm.
who don't think that Hamas is a terrorist organization
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and who don't believe that October 7th happened and that Israel murders babies and like all that stuff.
Right.
And you cannot educate them because
Right.
they do not want to hear it.
Right.
And it is not made for the nicest working environment.
It's very frustrating too because I'm by nature I'm not a confrontational person,
Mhm,
and so I find it very difficult to engage in conversation with people who have an opposing opinion from me. And
mhm,
um, I might try sometimes, but I know even when I'm trying that it's fruitless and pointless. So
mhm,
it just makes and just so it just highlights, Stacy, just how difficult combating anti-Semitism or any other kind of hatred is. It's usually deep-seated. It could go back generations, and if it's not multi-generational, then it's based on these conspiracy theories that for some reason people are trusting. And it's just, it's just hate is the hardest thing to overcome.
mhm.
And so the ADL of all organizations is working the hardest at it, raising a lot of money to do it, and it's coming up against a brick wall sometimes. So, and we see that just in 10 years how the anti-Semitic feelings have doubled around the world. So it's just terrible. Gabe.
Yeah, Rabbi, a couple of things. I would just like to know what do you think is causing Hollywood stars, actors, singers, professional athletes to sort of buy into what Stacey was saying, Jews kill babies, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
They can't be, I mean, they have all the information they could possibly have in front of them. There's no excuse there about not having proper education. They have all the information they have. What makes do you think those
So,
people
so I don't have the
can't?
answer. So, Gabe, I don't have the answer to that. The only thing that comes to mind about it is that um, there's right-wing hatred of people and groups, and there's left-wing hatred of people and groups. And for some reason, I don't want to like stereotype, but we think that most actors and artists are liberal leaning. And if they are liberal leaning, then a conspiracy theory out there is that Zionism is colonialism. And so, therefore, some are anti Israel, because Israel is seen as a Zionist colonialist state. So that again, this is
No,
very
I understand.
broad generalization, but that's one reaction to what you said, Gabe, that some people buy into that idea that Zionism is colonialism, and you're always for the underdog and for the oppressed, and the thinking is that the Palestinians are an oppressed people.
Right. And if you don't mind, I just want to follow
Yeah, go
up on
ahead.
anti-Zionist. I think most people, when you talk to most people, they don't even know what a Zionist is. They
Right,
might say, "Oh, I'm not anti-Jewish. I'm just anti-Zionist,"
right, right,
and they have no idea what they're talking
right,
about.
right,
And when, if you've been watching the news and you see the campus protests, and they go and they ask these kids, what are you protesting? They don't even know what they're
right,
protesting half the time.
right,
And more than likely, I would guess more than 50% of the people protesting are not even students. And it irritates me to see Jewish students on college campuses get harassed, not being able to go to class, and
right,
nothing being done about it. And I don't care what side of the aisle you're on, if you're a politician, you got to stand up for that. And we all
right,
know that academia leans 90% liberal. Again, I'm not trying to stereotype, but where are the Jewish academians that are supposed to be out there protecting Jewish students, where they just kind of hands off for political reasons, not to shake anybody's vote or to gain votes or to gain their positions, to maintain their positions? They don't want to
right.
rock the boat. That
Yeah.
gets a little bit
So,
under my
so
skin. I was wondering what you have to say
Yeah,
about
so
that.
Gabe, I talked about this last spring, almost a year ago, when the protests first started in April and May on college campuses across the country, and what the trends were at that time, especially, like you said, of non-students coming in to protest on a college campus. So some campuses, we have to give them credit for cracking down. It took a while, but they did crack down on the campuses, on the protests. And even President Trump has stepped into Columbia University to withhold funding, like $400 million worth of grants or other projects were put on hold for Columbia University to show that at least the president is taking these anti-Israel, anti-Semitic protests seriously. So there are some campuses have had commissions established to kind of look into it, like they normally do, and they have followed through on it. And some people have resigned or have been fired in leadership positions over these protests. So campuses have been cracking down to some extent or another, but not 100%. And so why there has been an increase in these protests on college campus, I have no idea. I really don't know. It's because, I guess one thing about this is my go-to position with other people is to respect other people and to think that we're all created in the image of God. That's my foundational kind of outlook on life. So if I had the outlook on life that I'm good and everybody else is bad, and that I hate other people, then maybe I could understand why there's hate in the world. But because that's not my mindset, it's hard for me to get into the mind of somebody who hates. And the extreme of that, how to understand how Hamas is thinking and acting against Israel, right? So Israel might be able to predict what Hamas can do, but since Israel isn't evil, and the generals coming up with the strategies for Israel are not evil people, it's hard to predict what evil people will do because you're not in their mindset, and you can't like the shock of how Hamas publicly displayed the hostages before they were released and all of that. Nobody in Israel would have expected something like that to happen. They expect a release to be, you hand over the hostages to the Red Cross, who hands it over to Israel. That's the way it's supposed to be done, and that's what they expected. Nobody in Israel, and even in the leadership, expected that anything like that would have happened because nobody in Israel is evil. So that's what the whole conversation about understanding trends in anti-Semitism. Yeah, you can, like the ADL reported, you can understand maybe the reason why anti-Semitism exists, but it doesn't get to the root cause of it. Why do people hate? And that I have no, I mean, that's the age-old question that religion tries to overcome, but people just tend to hate. Bob, you had wanted to say something.
Yeah, a couple of things. I was in Australia earlier in January, and on the news, I thought they had either the prime minister or the main person in think in Melbourne, where a
Yeah.
synagogue was defaced. So it was addressed, as far as I
Uh,
know. But two other things. Number one, have you ever heard of a guy by the name of Charles Jacobs?
not,
He spoke to our book club last week, and his title of his book was Betrayal: The Failure of American Jewish Leadership to Fight Anti-Semitism.
oh, huh,
Because he's saying they don't go far enough.
uh-huh,
Some of the things I don't necessarily agree with, but it's an interesting thing that we pour all this money into all these organizations, particularly ADL, and they don't do enough. But how do you teach a blind man to see and a
right,
deaf person to hear? I have no idea.
right, right,
But to sort of counter what you all have been saying, if somebody is anti-Netanyahu, they are not anti-Semitic and they're not anti-Israel.
oh, nobody's saying that.
Okay, so sometimes people think of Israel as Netanyahu. I'm anti-Israel.
That can happen. Yes, people do overgeneralize. That's right.
Yeah, so because I'm not a big fan, but don't say I'm
Oh,
anti-Semitic.
right, right. But I don't think anybody was saying that, Bob. So yeah, no. So to be clear, no, nobody. I was not saying that at all. And but yes. So some people who are anti-Israel could have anti-Israel feelings because they're anti-Netanyahu. I wasn't thinking that at all. I was thinking more of being anti-Israel because it's Zionist and the people who are anti-Zionist. So it's not about a particular prime minister or a particular party in Israel, but
Yeah, but
it's about
he
Zionism.
makes things worse.
So I don't want to go there, Bob, and we'll leave that. That is so. Gabe,
I'm
I'll let
sorry.
you have one more comment, and then we'll.
Yeah, now I was just going to say, as far as Netanyahu, you can take any Jewish leader and put him in there, and they're all going to do the same thing. They're going to protect the survival of Israel. So it doesn't matter what the name of the prime minister
Right.
is.
Yes.
What I what I worry about is, you could say, uh, countries that are anti-Semitic, they would love nothing more than to see a divide within the state of Israel of hating their leaders. That is a great strategy to try to create upheaval within the country by hiring these outside protesters, by getting Jewish people to hate each other based on their political leaders. This is not a smart thing for Jewish people to do, to be hating their leaders without knowing all the facts. And I think that misinformation that you were talking about earlier feeds into that. And I think that is
So I don't want to have a conversation about whether Netanyahu's right or wrong.
oh,
So
neither do
I'm not
I.
going to respond to that part, but I will respond to this in that those who sow hatred, those who promote it, the idea behind promoting hatred, one strategy that governments have and government leaders have in promoting anti-Semitism or in promoting anti-immigrants or something like that is to divert attention away from one problem onto another problem. So if we think something is like we're complaining about the price of eggs and a rise in inflation, well, maybe we won't think about it because we should really be thinking about how terrible illegal immigrants, the rise in illegal immigrants or the rise in fentanyl in this country, right? You divert attention from one thing to another. That was Hitler's strategy. That was all dictator's strategy. You focus on one group of people to focus the energy on that so that people forget about really what's going on and what's wrong with the country. So the anti-Semitism is a multifaceted problem. It's a religious problem. It's a societal problem. It's a human problem in our tendency, the human being's tendency to to be not trusting of somebody who's different, and why it's and no matter how energetic we are in trying to fight anti-Semitism, whether it's ADL or whether it's the author that Bob mentioned, there hasn't been the 100% cure for anti-Semitism found yet. But that doesn't mean we should give up the fight. We need to be aware of it. We need to be advocating for our rights, and hopefully one person at a time, if we can make influence, have some influence on somebody in conversation, then one person at a time, maybe we can make the world a better place. So have a good night, everybody. Take
Thank you,
care,
Rabbi.
and
That was
happy
excellent.
Purim later this week.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye.
Outstanding.